In the late 1980s, as the Cold War entered its final and most uncertain phase, Soviet air defense doctrine rested on a single assumption: nothing that flew could truly disappear. The Soviet Union had invested decades into layered radar networks, overlapping coverage zones, and interceptor forces designed to detect, track, and destroy intruding aircraft long before they reached sensitive targets. From early warning radars operating in the VHF band to higher-frequency fire control systems tied to surface-to-air missile regiments, the system was built on redundancy and persistence. If one radar missed a target, another would catch it. At least that was the theory. Western intelligence reports circulating through Moscow during this period described an American aircraft allegedly designed to evade radar entirely. The claims centered on a classified program known only by fragments of leaked terminology: low-observable shaping, radar-absorbent materials, unconventional geometry. To many Soviet planners, these reports sounded less like engineering and more like psychological warfare. Stealth, in their view, could reduce detection range, but it could not erase an aircraft from radar screens altogether. Physics did not bend for propaganda. That confidence was reinforced by experience. Soviet radar operators had tracked everything from high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft to low-flying strike fighters hugging terrain. Even the state Route 71, despite its speed and altitude, produced unmistakable returns. Aircraft could outrun missiles, jam radars, or exploit coverage gaps, but they could not simply appear and vanish without explanation. The idea of a combat aircraft penetrating defended airspace, completing its mission, and leaving without a firm track seemed implausible. By 1989, however, subtle anomalies were beginning to challenge that certainty. Isolated radar stations reported fleeting contacts that did not behave like conventional aircraft. The returns were weak, inconsistent, and often appeared only briefly before dissolving into background noise. Standard diagnostics showed no equipment failure. Weather conditions were normal. Yet the contacts did not persist long enough for reliable tracking or interception. At first, these incidents were treated as routine irregularities. Radar systems, particularly older models, were known to produce false returns under certain atmospheric conditions. But as reports accumulated across multiple sites, patterns began to emerge. The contacts appeared at similar altitudes, followed consistent corridors, and occurred during narrow time windows, often at night. Most troubling of all, the radar signatures did not match any known aircraft in Soviet or NATO inventories. Within command centers, a quiet tension grew. Analysts compared logs, adjusted filters, and increased transmitter power, only to watch the same phenomenon repeat. Each time, the contact lingered just long enough to suggest something real, then faded beyond detection thresholds. There was no crash, no visual confirmation, no interceptor contact. Only the uncomfortable implication that something had crossed defended airspace without being seen in the traditional sense. For a system built on certainty and control, the possibility was deeply unsettling. As concern grew, Soviet Air Defense Headquarters ordered a deeper technical review rather than an operational response. Doctrine dictated caution. Scrambling interceptors or activating missile batteries without a confirmed track risked exposing radar frequencies, engagement procedures, and command and control timelines to NATO intelligence. If the contacts were a deception or electronic probing effort, reacting too aggressively could hand the adversary exactly what they wanted. Instead, analysts were told to observe, document, and correlate. This approach reflected how Soviet air defense had evolved since the 1960s. The system was not a single shield, but a network of radars operating across multiple bands. Long-range early warning systems in the VHF range were designed to detect aircraft at hundreds of kilometers, while higher-frequency radars provided precision tracking for interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. In theory, an aircraft optimized to evade one frequency band should still appear on another. That principle had shaped Soviet confidence for decades. Yet the anomalous contacts defied those assumptions. On VHF systems, returns were inconsistent and often indistinguishable from clutter. On higher-frequency radars, the contacts appeared briefly but lacked the strength and stability of conventional targets. Attempts to cue fire control radars based on early warning data repeatedly failed. By the time the narrower beams swept the predicted airspace, There was nothing there to lock onto. Engineers examined whether electronic countermeasures could explain the phenomenon. NATO aircraft were known to carry jammers capable of degrading radar performance, but jamming typically produced recognizable effects. Noise spikes, false targets, or complete signal saturation. None of those signatures appeared. The radar systems were functioning normally, transmitting and receiving clean signals. Whatever was happening did not resemble known electronic warfare techniques. Flight profiles added another layer of concern. The contacts maintained steady speeds consistent with subsonic strike aircraft, generally between 500 and 600 knots, and altitudes that balanced fuel efficiency with terrain masking. They did not maneuver aggressively or exhibit erratic behavior. Everything about the tracks suggested deliberate planning rather than experimental flights or sensor errors. By late 1990, classified assessments began using cautious language. Analysts avoided definitive conclusions, but internal memoranda acknowledged the possibility that the United States had achieved a degree of radar signature reduction far beyond previous estimates. If true, it implied not just a new aircraft, but a shift in airpower doctrine. Penetration no longer depended on speed, altitude, or massed formations, but on remaining unseen long enough to strike critical targets. For senior commanders trained in the logic of attrition and layered defense, the implication was stark. A system designed to repel thousands of aircraft could be rendered irrelevant by a handful that never triggered alarms in the first place. The first opportunity to test these assumptions came not through theory, but through war. In January 1991, as coalition air operations began against Iraq, Soviet observers watched closely. Although the Soviet Union was not a participant, its intelligence services monitored the conflict in real time, collecting radar data, electronic emissions, and operational reports wherever possible. The opening nights of the air campaign were of particular interest, as Iraqi air defenses collapsed with a speed few had anticipated. What stood out was not the destruction itself, but the sequence. Fixed radar sites, command centers, and surface-to-air missile batteries were struck almost simultaneously, often without warning. Aircraft appeared to penetrate dense air defense zones without triggering sustained tracking or coordinated interception. To Soviet analysts, this resembled, in operational form, the same anomalies they had been logging for years. Post-strike analysis revealed that many of the initial attacks were conducted by a previously unacknowledged aircraft, the F-117A Nighthawk. Publicly revealed only months earlier, the aircraft embodied concepts Soviet engineers had long debated but never fully accepted as practical. Its faceted shape was designed to scatter radar energy away from the emitter rather than reflect it back, drastically reducing radar cross-section. Radar absorbent materials further attenuated whatever signal remained. Crucially, the F-117 did not rely on speed or electronic jamming for survival. It flew predictable routes at subsonic speeds, trusting its low observability rather than evasive maneuvering. This ran counter to decades of air combat theory, which emphasized agility, acceleration, and countermeasures. Yet combat results suggested the approach worked. Despite flying hundreds of sorties into heavily defended airspace, no F-117 was lost during the opening phase of the war. For Soviet air defense planners, this was the confirmation they had quietly feared. The earlier radar anomalies were no longer theoretical curiosities. They aligned with a real operational system now demonstrated under combat conditions. The implications extended far beyond a single aircraft type. If low-observable strike platforms could bypass detection, then fixed air defense networks, regardless of density, were vulnerable at their core. Internal discussions shifted tone. Rather than asking whether stealth was real, analysts debated how far behind they were. Developing comparable capabilities would require advances in computational modeling, materials science, and precision manufacturing that the Soviet industrial base struggled to provide even in peacetime. With economic pressures mounting and political authority weakening, the prospect of closing the gap grew increasingly remote. The war in Iraq did not merely showcase American air power. It exposed a structural vulnerability in Soviet doctrine at the very moment the state itself was losing the capacity to adapt. Inside Soviet command structures, the response to this realization was restrained, almost subdued. There was no public acknowledgement of doctrinal failure, no abrupt overhaul of air defense strategy. Instead, the issue was absorbed into classified studies and internal debates, where it competed with far more immediate concerns. By early 1991, the Soviet economy was contracting, fuel shortages were affecting training cycles, and entire air defense units were operating below authorized readiness levels. Even if the threat was understood, the capacity to respond was limited. Technically, countering low-observable aircraft presented challenges that went beyond upgrading radar power. Increasing transmitter output did not reliably improve detection of small radar cross-section targets, particularly when they're shaping redirected energy away from the receiver. Lower-frequency radars offered some promise, as their longer wavelengths interacted differently with angular surfaces, but they lacked the resolution required for precise tracking or weapon guidance. Detecting a stealth aircraft was one problem. Engaging it was another entirely. Some research institutions proposed multistatic radar concepts, using separated transmitters and receivers to capture scattered reflections. Others explored passive detection methods, including infrared search and track systems and exploitation of civilian broadcast signals. These ideas were not speculative fantasies. They were grounded in physics and existing technology. But implementing them at scale required time, funding, and political stability, all of which were increasingly scarce. Operational doctrine also came under quiet scrutiny. The Soviet model emphasized centralized control and rigid engagement procedures. Stealth aircraft, however, exploited predictability. Their success depended not just on reduced visibility, but on knowing how defenders would react. Adapting to that reality would have required decentralization, faster decision cycles, and greater autonomy at the unit level, reforms that clashed with institutional culture. As these debates unfolded, the anomalous radar contacts did not cease. Reports continued to surface of fleeting detections along familiar corridors, usually at night, often too brief to act upon. They were logged, categorized, and filed away. Officially, they were equipment limitations or environmental effects. Unofficially, many operators believed they were watching the same aircraft now seen on international news footage, flying operational missions with impunity. By the summer of 1991, the question was no longer whether Soviet air defenses had been penetrated, but whether it still mattered. The state they were designed to protect was unraveling. Command authority fragmented, budgets evaporated, and long-term research programs stalled or disappeared altogether. The future of air defense would be decided by a different country under a different flag. In that sense, the stealth aircraft represented more than a technological breakthrough. It became a symbol of transition, marking the moment when established certainties dissolved faster than institutions could respond. By the time the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991, the issue of stealth had shifted from an urgent operational threat to a lingering strategic reckoning. Files once stamped with the highest classifications were boxed, archived, or quietly transferred to successor institutions now operating under the Russian Federation. The radar anomalies, the internal assessments, and the uncomfortable conclusions remained, but they no longer carried the same political weight. Demonstrating vulnerability was no longer dangerous because the system itself had already collapsed. For the officers and engineers who had tracked those faint returns, however, the implications endured. Training manuals and doctrinal texts written in the previous decade suddenly felt obsolete. The assumption that air defense was a matter of saturation and attrition no longer held. A small number of aircraft, if sufficiently difficult to detect, could achieve effects once requiring entire bomber formations. That realization forced a reconsideration of priorities. Quantity mattered less than information, timing, and invisibility. In the years that followed, Russian air defense development took a more pragmatic direction. Rather than attempting to replicate the exact geometry and materials of the F-117, research emphasized counters. New radar systems were designed with wider frequency coverage, integrating VHF, L-band, and S-band sensors into unified networks. Passive detection concepts once discussed only in theory were pursued more seriously, leveraging infrared sensors and network data fusion to build composite air pictures from incomplete information. These efforts reflected lessons learned rather than immediate solutions. Even with improved systems, stealth aircraft remained difficult to track consistently, especially when flown with disciplined tactics and careful mission planning. Detection windows were narrow, engagement opportunities rare. The balance had shifted irreversibly in favor of the attacker, at least for the opening phase of a conflict. Meanwhile, the legacy of the F-117 extended beyond technology. It reshaped how airpower was conceived. Penetration no longer depended on overwhelming defenses through brute force. It depended on shaping the battlefield before the defender fully understood what was happening. That philosophy would influence subsequent aircraft designs, operational planning, and alliance doctrine well into the following decades. For those who had once dismissed stealth as fiction, the lesson was sobering. The threat had not announced itself with dramatic battles or decisive defeats. It revealed itself gradually, through weak signals, incomplete data, and a growing sense that something fundamental had changed. By the time proof was undeniable, the strategic balance had already shifted. The F-117 did not end the Cold War, but it arrived at a moment when old assumptions were collapsing. In that convergence, it exposed how quickly technological surprise could render even the most elaborate defenses uncertain. The full significance of those early encounters only became clear with time. When the F-117 was finally retired in the late 2000s, its combat record appeared modest in scale but outsized in consequence. Fewer than 60 aircraft had altered how major powers thought about air defense, penetration, and strategic warning. For Soviet planners who had once trusted in continuous radar coverage, the lesson was not merely technical. It was institutional. Systems built around certainty struggled when confronted with ambiguity. Stealth did not make radar useless, nor did it make air defense irrelevant. What it did was compress timelines and erode confidence. Detection no longer guaranteed tracking, and tracking no longer guaranteed engagement. Decision-makers were forced to act with partial information, often too late to influence events. That shift favored forces able to integrate intelligence, planning, and execution with extreme precision, while punishing those reliant on rigid procedures and delayed confirmation. In retrospect, the faint radar returns that appeared and vanished were not failures of equipment so much as early warnings of a changing battlefield. They signaled the arrival of a doctrine that valued invisibility over intimidation and preparation over reaction. By the time that doctrine was demonstrated openly, the strategic gap it created was already too wide to close quickly. Today, air defense systems around the world reflect those hard-earned lessons. They rely on networks rather than single sensors, fusion rather than certainty, and resilience rather than absolute control. Yet the underlying problem remains unsolved. Aircraft designed to be difficult to see still challenge even the most modern defenses, especially when paired with careful planning and operational discipline. For Soviet command, the realization came quietly, through ghostly contacts that could not be held and threats that could not be acknowledged. Fiction became fact not with an explosion, but with silence on radar screens where something should have been. That moment marked the end of one way of understanding airpower and the beginning of another, defined less by what defenders could see and more by what they could no longer assume. If you found this breakdown of Cold War technology and doctrine insightful, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps support deeper, carefully researched stories like this one.